Cool question sent in by Adolfo E. Good morning, Julio. One of the most critical issues for Germany during World War II was obtaining fuel to supply the war machine. However, one question that draws attention is the fuel used by the main German armored tanks, the Panthers. Unlike the Soviets and the British, who mostly used diesel engines, Germany used gasoline engines to power their tanks. Some of them had an absurd consumption of 10 liters per kilometer. That rate of 10 liters per kilometer, it's not quite 10, it's more like 9, okay? That's for the King Tiger, all right? The Panzer 6B, the heaviest of them all. Also, most German tanks had less range than the Allied tanks. Could you comment on the reason for this choice made by Germany for their armored vehicles? It's also worth noting that Germany had excellent technology for diesel engines, such as those used in the Kriegsmarine. Very well. Well, Adolfo, I think to answer your question, it's better to start from the end and go back to the beginning, right? In other words, from the bottom up. Let's get this Kriegsmarine issue out of the way right away, okay? Because Germany did have diesel technology, they did. But submarine engines are like a world apart from automotive engines, right? Engines for tanks, engines for road vehicles, and aircraft engines. So when we talk about naval technology, Army technology, man, it's so different. You might say they're armed forces of the same nation. Come on, they should collaborate, right? But that wasn't the reality. It had never been like that until that time, right? The whole procurement process, the specification, the whole selection process, the whole purchasing and production process, for the armed forces, it always worked separately, completely separately. And in fact, we've already pointed out here in several videos that there's a kind of underlying rivalry between generals and admirals, right? Which prevents one branch from being truly friendly, cooperative, or a real partner to the other. There's always a bit of rivalry to a greater or lesser degree, right? And we saw this in World War II at absurd levels, like in Japan, and at not so absurd levels, like in the United States. But even so, if you look above, right there, at the smooth surface of the water, you'll see the real size of the iceberg underneath the water. You'll see that there really was a rivalry between the Army and the Navy in the United States, which made things harder in World War II, right? It made things more difficult than they needed to be. But let's get back to the heart of the matter, okay? I've already set aside this issue of the Navy crisis, which really doesn't mean much. The fact that the country had diesel technology for submarines, why didn't they use that for tanks? Let's go.
Yep.
I have to tell you this. A lot of people start with cliches when studying World War II. Cliches they saw in some old documentary or that they saw in some movie or that a teacher told them at some point in their life. For those who like cliches, let me share another. It's not exactly a cliche, but I'll clarify something you can share confidently, all right? The Treaty of Versailles did work, yes. All right? The Treaty of Versailles did work, yes. The Treaty of Versailles didn't work. It did work, yes. Because all the limitations of the system, every part of the German war economy was constrained during the Second World War because of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay? So forget about that fairy tale that the Treaty of Versailles was useless, because it wasn't. It tied Germany's hands and feet in such a way that it didn't have a realistic chance of winning a major war against other European powers acting together, right? What do I mean by that? Why didn't Germany have diesel engines for tanks? Man, Diesel engines require a different production line than gasoline engines do. And the diesel engine, in terms of engineering, and I'll put it this way, at least in the 30s and 40s, right? In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, was more complex to engineer than a gasoline engine, right? So, you're talking about a country that went from 1918 to 1935, completely shackled because of the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. And when Hitler breaks with the Treaty of Versailles and rearms Germany, he has to work within that 15-year limitation. So it's not easy for the German industry to suddenly reach the levels of the other military powers on planet Earth. Okay, so the first reason why the Germans didn't have diesel engines for their tanks is because the German rearmament was done in a big hurry, because the deficit was very large. So the production of the Panzer, do you remember that the Panzer WWII is a little tank armed with 2 machine guns? For the Panzer II, they removed 1 machine gun and put a 20mm cannon there. For the Panzer III, which had a 50mm gun, for the Panzer IV, this one you're seeing here, look, which had a short 75mm gun in this version here at first. Let's note that all of this was done in 5 years. 4 years, actually, to be more exact. 4 years, from 35 to 39. So, for you to be able to get that many vehicles off the production line to produce that many vehicles, you're in a hurry during the conception stages, the design stages, the prototyping stages, and then you get to the final stage, right? Which is production. So you need tanks in large numbers, in great quantity, because the government says you have to have them, right? The order comes from above. What does the general from the technical branch, from the Army Weapons Office, the Heereswaffenamt, what do these people do to carry out these orders? You have to cut somewhere. You have to cut down on the complexity of the tank designs. So the tanks are built using what German industry knows how to make best and fastest. What is that? A gasoline engine. Did you get it? Hold on, man, but your explanation is only halfway there. But gasoline engines have high fuel consumption. And because of that, yes, you also have a very limited range, right? Very limited range, because the engines need to carry the immense weight of the vehicle with more and more armor. That's true. But for those who have already seen my other content here, especially those lessons about Hitler's generals, you'll remember that Guderian, General Guderian, and General Lutz, the 2 great pioneers of the concept of fast armored warfare in Germany, they were not unanimously accepted in the German army. Nowhere near universally accepted. They were actually a small minority. They were guys who were really kind of outsiders, you know? Outsiders within the German army's way of thinking. Who was the chief of staff of the German army at that time in the 1930s? It was a general named Ludwig Beck. Ludwig Beck was a cavalry general. And Beck, he understood that the role of the armored vehicle on the battlefield was to support the infantry, just like it was in the First World War, to support the infantry. Why do you think the Panzer IV, a beast of that size, comes with a short-barreled gun that doesn't have speed? Do you know why? Because that gun was designed to be able to blow up fortifications. It was designed to blow up concrete. To blow up concrete bunkers. Who faces concrete bunkers on the front line? Who faces them? Who gets stuck because of concrete bunkers? Is it tanks? No, my friend, it's soldiers. So this vehicle here was designed to be an infantry support vehicle, an auxiliary vehicle for the infantry. We can say the same thing about the first Stooges, right? Sturmgeschütz. Self-propelled artillery. What was it made for? Made to destroy the obstacle that was blocking the soldier's path. So, really, hardly anyone thought that tanks in the 1930s would have to travel hundreds of kilometers ahead of the infantry. And it keeps moving, right, at a very high speed. In other words, that tanks would be limited by their operational range on the ground. That was a shock. That was a shock in 1940. When Guderian's tanks, Roth's tanks, Hoth's tanks covered that immense distance, separating from the infantry vanguards, more than 100 kilometers ahead, right? Heading toward the coast. And they had to be resupplied by air. They had to be resupplied with barrels of fuel dropped by Junkers. 52. Can you imagine that? This method kept the tanks supplied since the trucks couldn't cover the long distance. German logistics were unprepared for armored warfare. Once that reality set in 1940, they started trying to minimize the problem. Let's always keep more fuel with the trucks, with those tanks to keep up with them farther ahead. But Germany's next challenge was Russia. And in Russia, the problem they had in France became a much bigger problem. And even though preparations for terrain similar to that of France were made in 1940 in Russia, the problem was much bigger. And the inadequacy of these vehicles here, look, which had been planned, manufactured before the war, became clear. Their inadequacy became clear. Their fuel tank, their range was limited. It was made for European theaters of operation, not for Russia. So now you needed to increase the range of these vehicles. And with gasoline, it results in shorter range, right? So what do we really see? What can we really figure out from this whole situation? When the Germans realize that their armored vehicle engineering model is obsolete, they're already in a situation where their industry can no longer change. Which situation? The situation where Operation Barbarossa proves to be unsolvable, right? It can't be solved in 1941. It's going to be extended into 1942. In other words, the demand for weaponry will exceed the limit. And in this way, there is no room. In the German industry, for development, for re-equipment, for creating new industrial tooling, to develop a whole new line of tanks with diesel engines. Do you understand? The model of the German heavy tank had been in development since 1937. When 1941 came and people started to realize that a large breakthrough tank would be necessary here, a large tank that could go up against even heavier Soviet tanks, Hitler ordered an emergency program for the development and construction of this armored vehicle. So, less than a year later, it was presented, right? On his birthday, April 20th, 1942. And the production of this new heavy vehicle, along with the new medium one, the Panther and the Tiger, was authorized in an extremely rushed manner. You might not know this, but Hitler, he realized the limitations of gasoline engines, right? The risk of fire, due to the impact of ammunition on the tank. And he ordered that the new Panther, the new Panzer V, the new German medium tank, should have a diesel engine. It was Albert Speer who ignored Hitler's orders. And he said that the Daimler-Benz prototype, which had a diesel engine, was not suitable. Yeah, it couldn't be produced in large numbers like the Man prototype, right? Which had a gasoline engine, could it? Was Speer wrong? No, Speer was being pragmatic. Really? The German industry wouldn't have been able to develop that, right? In the middle of the war. Would it have been possible? Yes, it would. But at the cost of a drop in production numbers. You would trade numbers for a longer development period. And how would that impact the front line? Do you understand? So it's that really tough decision that has to be made, right? In critical moments. So, guys, the Panzers kept using diesel engines until the end of the war. Remember that the Panzer VI, was supposed to be a kind of transitional vehicle until the development of the definitive heavy vehicle. Okay? The Panzer VI, the Tiger I, as it was conceived and approved in 1942, was supposed to be a transitional vehicle because at that moment the urgency was greater than the need, right? Let's say the prudence of developing a suitable vehicle. So the Panzer VI, which went down in history as the epic Tiger I, had to be a transitional vehicle. That's why we don't have a Panzer VII. We actually do have the Panzer VI-B. The B version would then be the definitive vehicle. What is the Panzer VI-B? The King Tiger, the Royal Tiger, the Königstiger. Okay? So it only goes into production in 1944, okay? So when the final vehicle goes into combat, the German industry is even less able to produce a different engine. A different supply chain, especially because at that time, German fuel production was focused on synthetic gasoline. For the Army, it was synthetic gasoline. So there wasn't much room to divide that production between gasoline and diesel either. The produced diesel was already sent to the Navy, right? So you understand that it's a matter of timing, of time, the decisions from the 1930s plus the reality of World War II made the Army High Command end up choosing to keep using gasoline until the end of the war, right? Other European nations, how did they behave, right? For example, Russia, which is mentioned here in Adolfo's question. Russia, man, also started with lots of gasoline-powered tanks. But the deep battle doctrine, right? Tukhachevsky's deep battle in 1936. And also the reality, right? The use of these Soviet tanks in Spain, the T-26s in particular, they showed the inadequacy of tanks with gasoline engines against anti-tank weapons, right? The use of German anti-tank weapons, particularly the first uses of the Flak 88 as an anti-tank gun in Spain, took out several T-26s. The Russians came to the conclusion that they needed to refit the T-26 with thicker armor. And thicker armor will require an engine with more torque. And the diesel engine is a good option for that. Even so, the Russians took a long time to put their first diesel engine into full production. It took a long time to be ready. The V2 engine, right? That doesn't mean 2 cylinders in a V. No, that's just the name of the engine. V2, okay? So this engine here, which started equipping the KV-1 and the T-34, it was much more complex to make. And at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the factories that made these engines, in Kharkov, for example, had to be completely dismantled and sent to Chelyabinsk, right there in the east of Russia, in the Urals. And what happened to the production of the T-34? The production of the T-34 in 1941 was emergency production. It had to be equipped with Mikulin M17 engines. The Mikulin M17 is a gasoline engine, so the first T-34S produced during the war, they had gasoline engines. They were equipped with gasoline engines. gasoline-powered T-34 until the Chelyabinsk factory started producing diesel engines. Again, the reasons why nations choose option A or option B need to be analyzed much more deeply, rather than simply saying it was stupidity or backwardness or blindness. There are more serious reasons behind these decisions, right? And let's remember, yes, that even though the Soviet tanks ended up choosing ended up choosing diesel in the end, right? Nor was it because they realized early on that diesel was superior. No, it was a whole set of factors that in the end determined the use of diesel for tanks, okay? Among them, of course, was combat experience, which showed that the use of diesel engines decreased. The risk of fire in a tank that's been hit, even though the biggest risk of fire for an enemy tank that's been hit wasn't the detonation of the fuel, it was the detonation of the ammunition inside. Did you like that answer? And do you want to continue your learning about military history from World War II? Look, I have this opportunity for you here, which is The Atom as a Weapon, my book about the development and use of atomic bombs in World War II. Here you'll learn how this weapon was developed and why its use was crucial to ending the conflict. It's available at the WWII store via the link in the description and the QR code on screen. And if you want a signed copy of this book, just send an email to Saladaguerre Agmail with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping.